The level of violent rhetoric and violent action in American political discourse and American politics is completely out of hand. It's out of control. And nobody seems to want to put a control valve in. Each time there's an incident, everyone expresses their outrage, but at the same time seems to want to pin the blame on everybody but themselves.
So Piers Morgan just called out America's toxic political rhetoric problem, and he's absolutely right. After 2 assassination attempts on Trump and the White House shooting last weekend, we're seeing unprecedented political violence. This breakdown of how inflammatory language drives real violence is crucial. Let's break this down.
The Center for Strategic and International Studies reported in September, it said in recent years, the United States has seen an increase in the number of left-wing terrorism attacks and plots, although such violence has risen from very low levels and remains much lower than historical levels of violence carried out by right-wing and jihadist attackers.
This is huge. CSIS isn't some partisan think tank. They're the gold standard for security analysis. When they document this shift, it carries real weight. What's striking is how little mainstream media coverage this statistic gets compared to right-wing violence stats.
But they note that 2025 marks the first time in more than 30 years that left-wing terrorist attacks outnumber those from the violent far right. And I think that is a pertinent point, which is if you go back in the last 30, 40 years, you'll see there's been a lot of violence on the right, a lot of violence on the left. But there's now a noticeable uptick in violence on the left.
30 years. That takes us back to the 1990s militia movement era. This completely flips the narrative that political violence is primarily a right-wing problem. The data shows rhetoric really does have consequences, and the left's Hitler comparisons are driving actual attacks.
And many people, and I would be one of them, would apportion that, I think, to the ridiculously over-the-top rhetoric that's often used about Donald Trump and his administration, calling him Hitler, calling them a bunch of Nazis and so on. You know, as I made the point many times on this show, if you keep saying that people are Hitler and the Nazis, a deranged mind is going to compute that as a direct incentive to perform a public duty, a service to the country by removing Hitler and the Nazis and expect to be applauded for it.
Exactly right. We saw this with both Trump shooters who explicitly cited saving democracy as motivation. Dehumanizing language creates moral permission for violence. When you convince someone they're fighting literal Nazis, assassination becomes a heroic act in their mind.
If you over-egg the rhetorical souffle in that way, you are going to make impressionable minds think this is a good thing to be doing. Would you agree?
Love that phrase, over-egg the rhetorical souffle. He's nailing the core issue here. Words have power, especially when amplified by social media algorithms that reward the most extreme takes. Impressionable minds absolutely do compute Hitler rhetoric as a call to action.
And I think AI is going to make this a lot worse because it'll become increasingly hard to be able to tell reality from fiction. And so people will have their natural political bias sort of cemented and fermented by AI in a way that I think is going to get increasingly dangerous.
This AI point is terrifying and underappreciated. We're already seeing deepfakes in political campaigns. When people can't distinguish real from artificial content, confirmation bias becomes weaponized. The echo chambers will become even more dangerous and isolated from reality.
I mean, for Donald Trump, you know, I think what happened at the weekend was disgusting and appalling, and the twisted manifesto of the shooter was repellent to read. And he'd clearly been whipped up into thinking he had to attack Trump and his top people because of what he'd seen and heard from people deliberately using inflammatory rhetoric, which is wrong.
Smart move here. He's establishing moral authority by condemning the attack first. This is how honest analysis works. You can't critique inflammatory rhetoric while ignoring violence. But notice he's setting up to challenge both sides equally.
But at the same time, it's only a week or so since Donald Trump was brazenly posting on X about wanting to annihilate 90 million Iranians, right? So, you know, at what point do we accept that the rhetoric on all sides about almost everything has got out of control?
That Iran post was incredibly reckless timing. With tensions already at breaking point and Israeli strikes ongoing, casual talk about annihilating 90 million people feeds the same violence cycle. The hypocrisy critique here is spot on. Everyone needs accountability.
The intellectually honest position on this is surely that you should be able to condemn whoever, whatever party you have an allegiance to, whatever, you should be able to condemn unreservedly all violence against police on January the 6th and all violence against police or civilians or stores or whatever during any of the BLM riots. To me, that is an intellectually honest position.
This intellectual honesty test is perfect. Most people fail it completely. They condemn violence only when it comes from the other side. True moral consistency means calling out January 6th and the BLM riots equally. Tribal loyalty shouldn't trump basic principles.
January the 6th really incensed me, actually, for the scenes it sent around the world about this attack on democracy, at the heart of American democracy. It was awful. And anyone who tries to pretend to me this was a great patriotic act is just talking nonsense. But the murder of Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare, shot brazenly in the streets of New York, where I currently am, and the lionization by many on the left, especially younger members of the left, of his killer, Luigi Mangione, the idea he was some kind of modern-day Robin Hood hero for murdering a husband, a father, a son, in the way that was done.
The Mangione hero worship really was a cultural low point. Social media was flooded with thirst posts about his looks while ignoring that he murdered a father of two. When attractiveness becomes a moral defense for assassination, society has lost its compass.
Yeah, the reaction was almost as appalling as the murder itself. It's like, this guy's not a hero. He's a cold-blooded assassin of the kind that we used to be able to all agree should be condemned by everybody, but that didn't happen. And this is my problem, is I think, Joe, that people's reactions, their sensitivity, we're getting numbed to this stuff to the degree that people think it's perfectly okay to say, you know what, he had a point, that Mangione, and by the way, he's good looking, isn't he? What? What? You know what I mean?
This romanticization of violence is genuinely disturbing. The same people who condemned January 6th were making Mangione fan art and calling him a folk hero. We're conditioning an entire generation to think murder is acceptable if the cause seems just.
And annihilate an entire civilization. It wasn't just the 6 members of Congress. Trump called for General Milley to be publicly executed. Remember, he sent out that image of a President Joe Biden hogtied in the back of a pickup truck. Chris, this stuff needs to be condemned by you and your side.
Joe, I'm going to leave it there. What I would say about that is I don't disagree with you. I think some of Trump's rhetoric goes way too far. I thought some of the stuff against the Iranians was appalling for the President of the United States.
Agreed.
Borderline.
The CBS double standard is glaring. They'd never repeat unverified sexual assault claims about a Democratic politician, but with Trump, anything goes. Norah O'Donnell knew exactly what she was doing, legitimizing defamatory conspiracy theories under the guise of journalism.
He said he was a pedophile and was a rapist, and CBS 60 Minutes then repeated that as if it didn't matter. But actually it does matter. And then for Norah O'Donnell to say, oh, well, you think he meant you? Of course she knew who the guy was talking about. Of course she knew it was highly defamatory. Of course she knew it was incredibly abusive to Trump to do that in an interview for 60 Minutes. And Trump understandably lost his rag. So
completely unethical journalism. You don't amplify a shooter's manifesto claims in a news interview, especially unverified sexual allegations. O'Donnell was baiting Trump with inflammatory content, then acting innocent when he reacted. Basic professional standards were abandoned here.
There is a double standard about the way that many on the left and the media, which is very left skewed, I'm sorry, it is in America. I see it all the time. I've worked in it long enough to see it. And there is a double standard about the way Trump gets treated compared to anybody else. And should he temper his rhetoric? Absolutely.
His international perspective is valuable here. He's worked in British, Australian, and American media. When an outsider consistently sees left-wing bias in U.S. newsrooms, that observation carries weight. The double standard in Trump coverage is obvious to anyone paying attention. Should
the others look at themselves and think, are we partly to blame for the mindset of a apparently, genius-level guy who was an award-winning teacher, no sign of any violence, suddenly deciding to get on a train from California to Washington to plan a massacre at the White House? How has that happened? I don't know the answer. But I do know the language that he repeated in that manifesto was very similar to a lot of the bullshit language I hear about Trump all the time from the left. And that has to change too.
This is the key question. How does a gifted teacher with no violent history suddenly plan mass murder? The manifesto language directly echoed MSNBC and CNN talking points about fascism and democracy. Individual responsibility matters, but so does the media ecosystem.
I got to leave it there, guys. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. It was a really good debate, a really interesting debate.
Piers.
I appreciate
Thanks,
it.
everybody.
Thank you all very much.
This balanced approach is exactly what's missing in political discourse. He condemned violence from all sides, called out media bias, and demanded consistency. More journalists should follow this model instead of partisan cheerleading disguised as analysis.